Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. The Middle East conflict continues, and with it has come growing concern over the implications of the global food sector. Joining us today to talk about how the conflict and specifically the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is impacting the global food sector is Simon Duke, Managing Editor at Expana. Welcome, Simon. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Sarah. Pleasure being here, and thank you for the invite.
For those of you in our audience that are tuning in, we appreciate you being with us. And if you have any questions for Simon, feel free to post those in the chat area on your screen. If you're joining us from social media, post those right directly in your social feed, and we'll get those over to Simon. So Simon, talk to us about how the ongoing Middle East conflict, how it's affected agricultural production and food supply chains within the region, and kind of what direct impact the conflict has had on local food systems.
Thank you for that, Sarah. It's a big question for sure. And I find it very challenging to sum up everything that's been going on over the past couple of months. But at Expana, we have been providing daily news coverage on this conflict since it began, monitoring market reactions, price shifts, and given frequent deep dives into individual commodities. Needless to say, I've been busy. On a general note, let's say that the crisis began as a logistics shock. Disruption to Hormuz transit immediately drove volatility in oil, natural gas, freight, and agricultural commodity markets, so delaying flows of goods and increasing transport costs. And as the conflict escalated, this quickly fed into input cost inflation with higher fuel prices, raising shipping, packaging, and processing costs across food supply chains. I'll take Iran itself as a case study. I mean, the current US blockade of Iranian ports, should it continue, could severely hit food and grain imports into the country. And it could also impact hundreds of thousands of tons of grains and oilseeds being imported into the country. Now, Russia, who is an important grain supplier to the north of Iran via the Caspian Sea, could provide an alternative, but that supply source is a not like-for-like replacement. The Our Grains Market reporters observed that even though Russia has expanded Caspian export infrastructure and market players say shipments to Iran have risen, the route lacks the scale and efficiency of deep water Gulf trade and cannot compensate for disruptions there. Iran is also a large buyer of Brazilian corn. However, imports slumped to basically zero in March, and it's not likely they will return. And as for soybeans and soy meal, critical raw materials, last season's imports are estimated to around 2 million tons each, sourced primarily from South America and Canada. So far in this crop year, we understand that there are insufficient seed and meal stocks. So as this port blockade and Hormuz situation persists, Iran faces severe shortage of feed ingredients, threatening livestock production and food security across the country. And last but not least, you may know that Iran is one of the top global pistachio producers and exporters. Well, Iranian pistachio shipments have already faced disruptions that predated the conflict. And the crop itself has been impacted by drought. So today's crisis is actually compounding an already constrained situation.
So you got drought and you got the conflict going on at the same time. Oh my gosh, it's not a best case scenario by any means. So then what does it mean in terms of the general influence of the conflict on global food prices when we talk about grain and oil exports? You said you've been following this closely. What's kind of the trends that you're seeing?
I'll try to stay short, but generally speaking, the Middle East conflict has pushed global food prices higher, mainly through energy-driven cost inflation and disruption to grain and oilseed trade flows. Globally, according to the FAO Food Price Index published in early April, food prices rose in March 2026. Wheat increased by about 4% and vegetable oils by about 5%. And they attributed that largely to the higher energy costs and stronger biofuel demand. Global supply is on the whole adequate, so it's more about the volatility than it is about the shortages. In early March, the FAO warned that grain imports into the Middle East were likely to be slashed, reducing demand in the region while creating uncertainty for exporters. Higher energy prices and logistical risks supported prices in oilseeds, especially for vegetable oils linked to biofuels. Basically, the conflict has raised global food prices, not by cutting global grain and oilseed supply, but by making it more expensive and uncertain to move that supply. Energy-linked cost inflation has pushed prices up. Energy-linked cost inflation has pushed prices up, particularly for oilseeds.
What about fertilizer prices and availability? Food is, of course, very much influenced by that. What's the outlook? And it probably depends on how the conflict continues or doesn't continue. But what are you guys kind of seeing? When might those prices even return to some normalcy?
That's the million-dollar question, but I can't really comment on what the future of fertilizer prices may look like. But of course, the inability to send material through the Strait has been a big factor pushing up the fertilizer prices since the conflict began. Our Iranian strikes damaged gas infrastructure, feeding nitrogen fertilizer production in Gulf states, while production containments in South Asia are compounding supply constraints as regional plants struggle with both scarce and expensive gas supplies. So restarting those plants will depend on how quickly that energy situation normalizes. And repairing the Gulf's damaged infrastructure and restoring output will require both time and confidence that the conflict is indeed over and that any products will definitely reach markets. And phosphate fertilizers, in addition to disruptions in ammonia, are also facing a tight market for sulfur. Nearly half of globally traded sulfur originates in the Persian Gulf. Current damage to Middle Eastern refining capacity could require a few years to repair, further constraining sulfur availability for phosphoric acid production. That is the key feedstock for phosphate fertilizers, as well as for phosphates used in animal nutrition. So what impact will the crop have? Will this have on crop production? It will depend. For many crops being planted now, for example, sunflower seeds in Ukraine, the EU, and Russia, fertilizer deliveries will already have taken place for purchases placed several months ago. Still, in other geographies, lower fertilizer stocks and imminent needs have moved up the timeline. For example, in Australia, an area dependent on Gulf-produced fertilizer, which quickly began to experience the crisis, there had already been reports of farmers adjusting their crop rotations ahead of winter planting, with some reducing wheat acreage in favor of oilseeds, pulses, and barley. However, as you can imagine, farmers globally will be keenly awaiting signs of easing for the fertilizer prices. And if they don't have the shipments in time for planting, that implies that they will have to produce with fewer inputs, which will affect the next season.
Now, here in the U.S., they're saying fall is going to be the real key time when we, we're starting planting here already on corn and beans. So it's when it come back to the fall, what's going to happen. Yeah. Now, as we see, traffic through the Strait, it's resumed, it's not resumed, it's kind of back and forth. But let's be really hopeful and say it was to open today. We still are going to have a long time ahead of us, I would assume, till everything regained in terms of some of that normalcy we talked about when it comes to food and fuel inventories. Do you have any indication? I've heard something like even Q3, it could be that far out. Are you guys taking a look at when we could, if everything opened up now, when still we'd have to deal with all of these situations that are going on in terms of being able to get some of these products?
There again, that's a great question. I wish I could provide a real crystal clear answer to that. Yeah, just to say that, well, the situation is very unclear and it keeps on changing, doesn't it, Sarah? Commercial shipping can't resume without a proper peace deal. The White House has now set a new deadline, has not set a new deadline for the extended ceasefire. That's the nuance of today. And Iran's chief negotiator says it's not possible to reopen the Strait because of breaches of the ceasefire by the US and Israel. And the Iranian president said, I believe earlier today, that the US blockade and breach of commitments are the main obstacles to these negotiations. Now, that doesn't really answer your question, does it, Sarah? But I've got some insight from the Expana team to share. Now, should the Strait open for good, a return to normal will definitely take time. While shipping through Hormuz can resume relatively quickly, normality, which is, let's say, stable supply, rebuilt inventories, and predictable pricing, typically takes several months. Even with a permanent ceasefire announcement and reopening, Expana market experts argue that the situation can remain highly uncertain. Reopening the strait does not instantly restore flows because shipping confidence, insurance, and security guarantees come with a delay to the political announcements. At the same time, the disruption has created a system-wide shock affecting energy, fertilizers, and agricultural supply chains simultaneously. So this means recovery is constrained not just by shipping capacity, but by interlinked bottlenecks, fuel availability, input costs, and logistics networks. Now, the consensus I'm hearing right now is a matter of weeks for clearing backlogs and restoring basic shipping flows, a few months for gradual normalization of fuel distribution and freight logistics, and several months for full stabilization of production, pricing, and supply chains.
So what role do international sanctions and trade restrictions play in exacerbating food insecurity and in the conflicted, affected areas of the Middle East?
It's hard to see the direct consequences right now, but on the whole, international sanctions and trade restrictions significantly worsen food insecurity in conflict-affected regions, be it the Middle East or, for that matter, anywhere else in the world where war is raging. This is mostly because they disrupt the systems that make food available, affordable, and deliverable. The FAO has warned and continues to warn that disruptions to key trade corridors, such as the Strait of Hormuz, create severe shocks to global commodity flows with strong implications for food prices and access. In practice, this means higher energy and transport costs quickly feed into grain and oilseed prices, pushing up inflation. At the same time, sanctions reduce export revenues and weaken local currencies, meaning households face rising food prices even when supplies are technically available. Sanctions and trade restrictions also complicate the humanitarian response. NGOs consistently report that financial restrictions slow transfers, increase compliance burdens, and delay procurement and delivery of food aid. Even when food and medical supplies are exempt, banking restrictions and shipping risks make operations slower and more expensive. So as a result, humanitarian assistance often arrives later and at lower scale than needed during crises. And last but not least, the WHO, the World Health Organization, has also warned that conflict-related environmental damage can contaminate water and food systems, compounding both hunger and health risks. For now, Iran and Lebanon face reduced access to both commercial food and humanitarian aid and rising food insecurity. In the long run, international agencies warn that millions and millions of additional people in the region could face severe hunger if the conflict continues.
Wow. Yeah, that's something we're all going to have to watch, and hopefully it does not get to that level. So what are the key things, some of the key things that you and the Expana team are going to be watching here in coming weeks as the negotiations, I guess you can say, continue to go back and forth, but what are some of the things you're really focused in on?
Yeah, to answer that, I think I'll steal some comments made this morning by Anna Mans, who is the Chief Financial Officer at Nestle. They had their quarterly results this morning, and there was an earnings call with investors, and she identified three primary risk areas: supply chain disruption, commodity inflation, and consumer impact. So those are the three main things to be observing. But from my perspective, the single most important driver for all commodity markets in the very near future is whether shipping through the Strait of Hormuz resumes or remains interrupted. Recent volatility shows that even when traffic resumes, confidence is fragile and reversible. Even if diplomacy improves, markets will focus on whether shipping lines return at normal scale, insurance rates normalize, and tanker queues clear without recurring bottlenecks. From an agricultural markets perspective, the Iran-US negotiations will be an indirect driver of costs, logistics, and risk pricing across the global food and ag value chain. Any escalation, risk, or breakdown in talks tends to raise crude oil volatility and reintroduce a geopolitical risk premium. That feeds directly into agriculture through diesel, fertilizers, agrochemicals, freight, you name it. For global farming systems, energy is so embedded in every stage of operations, be it from farm to fork, that even small moves in oil prices can ripple quickly into farm margins and food manufacturing costs. And as we discussed earlier, closely linked to this is the fertilizer market, which is one of the most sensitive pressure points. Fertilizers are highly exposed to natural gas and Middle East linked supply chains, and that's another area we'll be monitoring closely. Higher energy and fertilizer costs compress margins for food processors and retailers, and pass-through of that to consumers will occur if these cost pressures persist. Livestock markets are also indirectly affected through feed costs. Corn and soybean meal respond quickly to energy and fertilizer shocks, and that has consequences for poultry, pork, and dairy economics globally. And finally, there is the broader macro layer. The Iran-US negotiations influence risk sentiment, currency movements, and inflation expectations. All of this impacts agricultural competitiveness, of course. And the longer-term cost impact of the conflict on food items is not yet clear. But inflation is expected, and so is deterioration in consumer spending. But at what magnitude? That anyone can answer that for right now. I mean, anyone's opinion is good here. And let's say a bit left field here, last but not least, is the psychology of market players and their intentions to invest. You can't overlook market sentiment and human feelings. And this is really starting to bring the kind of existential questions to the surface right now. So bear with me here, Sarah, but I'll finish with a quote from H.G. Wells, the author of The War of the Worlds. Well, he once said, "If we don't end war, war will end us." I'll leave that floating there for a second.
Yeah, exactly. Great way to end that. And lots of things, no shortage of things to be watching and to paying attention to, even those things that maybe we don't always think about, like you mentioned, the psychology of everything. So Simon Duke, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate you being here and sharing your insight with us.
An absolute pleasure. Thank you, Sarah.
Likewise, we appreciate all of you tuning in today. Until next time for Feedstuffs, I'm Sarah Muirhead.